Hey, this is John Ridley.
And this is Matt Carey, documentary editor at Deadline.com.
Matt, how are you?
Oh, great. Great. I'm very excited about today's episode.
I'm excited with you. I think both of us, when we found out that we were going to be able to have a conversation about the restoration of probably one of the best documentaries about filmmaking ever. And honestly, just a great documentary at all. In fact, Gene Siskel, the year that this documentary was released, said it was the best film of the year, not only the best documentary, but a look at Eleanor Coppola's really insightful documentation of her husband, who is Francis Ford Coppola, making one of the most insane, crazy, and ultimately great films in the history of cinema, which is Apocalypse Now. And the film is Hearts of Darkness, a little play on Heart of Darkness, a filmmaker's apocalypse, which is, as mentioned, the story of Francis Ford Coppola making this film.
Right. And for those who know their classic literature, of course, Hearts of Darkness was referring to Heart of Darkness, the Joseph Conrad story, which was the inspiration for Apocalypse Now.
It's an incredibly personal tale. It's an incredibly powerful tale. And I will say this to anybody who is even thinking about being a filmmaker, I would really encourage you to watch this. We had the opportunity to speak with Fax Bahr, who is one of the co-directors of the documentary, as well as James Mockoski, who is one of the principals at American Zoetrope, which is Francis Ford Coppola's independent film studio and the entity through which he's made actually several really, really amazing films that he's directed, as well as films that he's produced, and produced along with a guy named George Lucas. I don't know if you're familiar with the name, but he and Francis worked a bit. You and I, we love this conversation. I don't want to waste any more time because this is one of our longer episodes, and I would encourage our audience to please listen to every bit of it. It's a phenomenal conversation. Again, here's Fax Bahr, who is the co-director of Hearts of Darkness, and James Mockoski, who's one of the principals at American Zoetrope. We want to welcome to the show the two creators behind the restoration of Hearts of Darkness, Fax Bahr and James Mockoski. James, Fax, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for having us.
Matt and I both had the opportunity to see the film again just last night before our conversation today. The thing that I remember most from the first time seeing that film was the moment when Francis Ford Coppola walks into a light box and bangs his head. And I said, if that's what being the director is all about, perhaps this is not the job for me.
And carries on.
Oh, that's where it starts. Walks through, carries on, and makes this film. There's a lot to talk about. And it's incredible to believe it's almost 50 years since the making of this film, essentially 50 years since the film began its proper filming.
It's scary to watch someone you love confront failure, death, fear of going insane.
It's what it was really like. It was crazy.
I was making it on the crest of the acclaim of the Godfather films.
Every day, 100 problems. But I don't know what I'm doing.
I said, who is this Willard? And Francis looked me square in the eye and he said, he's you.
Brando agreed to the $1 million a week.
Are they seriously saying that Marlon would not show up?
It was like you were in a dream.
I was not in the greatest of shape.
Just do what I ask.
Marty's had a heart attack.
I really had a close call.
Film is not about Vietnam. It is Vietnam.
Before we get into the film, before we get into the work itself and Eleanor Coppola's phenomenal document about her husband making perhaps one of the most insane films that also became probably a touchstone of cinema, let's just walk back. And if you can, for a younger generation, and even for people who maybe saw it in 79, never saw it again, just talk about the film itself and its genesis and how it started filming, and then how it became, or at least Eleanor's participation in her husband's work.
Well, I think there's a great moment in the documentary where Francis Ellie says, I think he just gave me a project to just keep me busy. Which, you know, bringing the family over to the Philippines at that time and how everyone was going to figure out what they were going to do. She wanted to do her own work. She was her own artist in her own right, and she did her own concept commercials and small documentaries in the 70s. So she was a filmmaker, you know, but she was more in the Joseph Beuys, sort of ephemeral artist to be art. And
Right.
so when she went to the Philippines, it sort of fell into sort of a role, not a larger role, to document her husband's work. But it was interesting, and Fax probably can explain a little bit more about kind of that genesis of how Ellie got involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think Francis was, I think it's exactly as you described. Francis was, he knew that Ellie was going to be there. He wanted her to be involved in some way, I think. He probably was concerned that she was just not going to, have enough to do. And so he said, go ahead and do this. And the thing that's amazing is that she really did it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She didn't just shoot an EPK, which I think is how it was maybe originally pitched. Was that it, James? Though Francis was like, well, let's do a behind the scenes.
Studios always send out their own crew to do behind the scenes and documentary. He's like, no.
A little publicity
We'll take control over it ourselves, you know. And he was shrewd in those matters. He knew, and he could bill back, that work. But it's so much of Francis's style, and you look at all his films, and family is always sort of the centerpiece. Behind the camera, more so of what can the kids do, what can the kids learn, makeup. There's a great shot in the documentary where the Romans learning how to do wounds, and it was a teaching experience, and he wanted all his family to just sort of participate in some level.
Yeah, one of the things about the documentary that's really remarkable, you see many, many things, but to see his children who have gone on to be amazing artists in their own right. As you say, Eleanor was her own artist. And to see that even some of the shots, and she talks about his estate up in the Napa Valley area was a place where artists would go and hang out. And she talked about, oh my God, it became its own burden, entertaining. And to a degree, she would rather be with him, even in the Philippines during monsoons, creating than merely being Mrs. Coppola. She wanted to be Eleanor and be her own artist. And to Francis' credit, he wanted his family to understand art.
Yeah, I mean, for the very first film, she was assigned to be sort of costumes or in the prop department for Dementia 13. So she really wanted to be part of that craft and do her own thing.
Mr. Coppola had set up at that point American Zoetrope, which was basically this idea of, hey, we're going to bring artists together and we're going to do art, and we're going to be a bit outside of the system. Friends or individuals who work with them and are included in the documentary, people like George Lucas, who I'd forgotten, and in watching the documentary again, was meant to be the original director of Apocalypse Now, which was meant to shoot originally in about 68 or 69.
Mm-hmm.
And they wanted to go to Vietnam. And someone mentions in the documentary, we would have landed right about at Tet and for 3 weeks of shooting. And so if you can talk about Zoetrope and just that, I mean, what happened was insane, but even the concept of, we're going to go shoot in the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, they're going to see that we're filmmakers and they're not going to care.
But it is sort of the spirit of Zoetrope that, we're not tethered to a studio system of what reality. This is how you make a film.
Right.
I mean, it's just sort of, I could go to the Philippines, I could go to Vietnam and shoot this. Who's going to fund that? That's not safe. It didn't matter to them. It's just like, we could do anything that we want to do. And Francis loved that concept of just letting people, that's how they wanted to tell the story, provide them the opportunity to do that. And don't be bothered with the reality of things, Of course, you'll be grounded and you'll get people to say, no, you really can't do that. But something comes out of that. And he doesn't want to be the guardrails, so to speak, for other people's art. And of course, George and John probably realize, that's not a great thing. And then they branched off and did their own thing. John had his own.
Being John Milius,
Yeah.
you're referring to
Yes.
the screenwriter.
George Lucas having Star Wars, it's sort of they split apart and did their own thing. And then Francis is left wondering, well, what now? At Zoetrope in the mid 70s, just finished Godfather 2 and had these projects. He said, well, I know I own Apocalypse Now. I'll just do it. And so it was sort of the necessity of what next? What should I do? And the people that were originally assigned to it are doing their own thing. You know, who's to begrudge or George for doing Star Wars? You know, so you know.
That turned out pretty well for George.
You're right.
So the great thing about Francis, he sort of stumbles into these things. You know, with Godfather, he sort of stumbled into these situations, and he made great things. And he was just timing, luck, the right time. You know, I'm still waiting for that luck in the timing.
As are we all.
In fact, I wanted to ask you, as the director, you directed along with George Hickenlooper and Eleanor Coppola, and wondering what that collaborative process was like in actually putting together Hearts of Darkness.
Well, I think Francis and Ellie were pretty hands off. They were very respectful of filmmakers. I mean, I think, you know, going back to the origins of Zoetrope, it was breaking the studio system to allow filmmakers to finally be free. And at the end of the movie, Francis was very serious. I think this is at the core of his DNA, and the whole concept that he and George had of making Zoetrope was maybe some little girl in Ohio will take her dad's camcorder and make a masterpiece. You know, we can break the studio system. I mean, they read the outline that I had, the synopsis. They said, okay, this makes sense. Francis said, I don't care if you show me with my shirt off. Just tell the story truthfully. And, you know, I would share cuts with them, and they were very, they gave great notes and were involved in that way. I mean, looking at cuts and giving suggestions, but for the most part, they left us alone.
I'd say, you know, the question of why 11 years after, you know, it was called Apocalypse Now documentary. That was what she was supposed to create in the 70s. 3 years, so raw in their experience, and then jumping from Apocalypse Now, people really have to realize Francis, this was his first bankruptcy. Apocalypse was really financially hurt the family, and they had to jump quickly to another situation. So with one fire into another fire and doing one from the heart. So I don't know if there was a hunger at that time to revisit the wounds of Apocalypse. And it was probably best just to let it sit for 10 years or so. Let it just sort of have, you know, time. Give you sort of perspective. And I think that's what Fax and his team really helped with that.
Let me throw this in. She shot 80 hours of footage on 16 millimeter.
Oh, wow.
And there were documents and audio tapes. I mean, there was so much material. And I think it was just daunting to try and kind of get a handle on all that material. And as James said, you know, with all this sort of personal trauma that went along with being in that experience, it was like they just let it sit.
When you talk about personal trauma and things like that, and there are moments, and one of the things with Mr. Coppola is he's an incredibly honest person in my perception about what these experiences are. He doesn't sugarcoat it. Oh, being a director is wonderful. And he talks about, and some of this opens the film where this is going to be a disaster. I am never going to recover. And you want to look at a leader, whether, you know, it's a banking or the airline industry, that they stand in front of you and say, it's all going to be good. I'm your leader and I can get you there. I can't imagine what it was like for him. I can't imagine what it was like for Eleanor to view it. In fact, I'm curious for you, you're there. Again, as I understand it, meant to be a 3-week shoot, goes over 200 days, and that's not even 200 contiguous days. There are heart attacks. There are arguing about money with Marlon Brando, which to me is weird because obviously Mr. Coppola helped resurrect his career. All of this happening. What was it like for you, trying to be both objective, but knowing many of these players and being there over all this time with them? You know, you talk about other people's trauma. What was, when it was finally done, where were you mentally and emotionally?
When you mean when I started with the footage, or
when you were done just shooting the documentary itself?
Oh,
when you were finally leaving the Philippines and it was like, okay, I think
Fact
I'm not
wasn't
coming back.
part of that.
Okay,
Yeah,
you were not there. You were only there. All right.
I wasn't there at the Philippines. I was in high school actually when they were shooting Apocalypse Now.
Hey, wait a minute. Lauren, let me just interrupt there and say Lawrence Fishburne was 14 years old when he made
That's
you.
true.
You could have been on that.
Right. Okay.
I wasn't
Sorry.
aware of Francis at the time.
Okay.
All right. Well, that does help because I am also sitting here going, you've aged amazingly well.
Well, actually, Fax has a really good story about how this sort of came about, because it's the two people, George Zaloom and Lee Mayfield, and how they discovered it. Fax, tell us a little bit about that.
Go with that, because that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, it was 1989, and George Zaloom. I was doing electronic press kits for George Zaloom. That he and Les Mayfield had a company that did behind the scenes publicity and promotional work for the studios. And George came to me one day and said, "I just read Eleanor Coppola's notes, and we were coming up on the 10-year anniversary of Apocalypse Now's release." And he goes, have you ever heard of any of this footage being released? I said, no. And he goes, I'm going to call Zoetrope. So he just called up to Zoetrope, and they were like, oh, you guys want to talk about it? Sure, come on up. They were very amenable to talking to anybody who had any interest in the footage. We came up and we pitched the idea, and I sort of had this concept of how to structure the film, and they were like, oh, that sounds good. And they were cautionary about there's a lot of footage, and some of it isn't, some of it's out of focus. And we said, well, can we just see some of the reels? And they gave us some reels. We went to some, and it was all on 16 millimeter work print. We took it over to a screening room in San Francisco, and it was like our jaws dropped at how beautiful this footage was. I mean, it was just incredible. So I cut together a reel, spent a few months cutting together a select scenes reel. It was, I don't know, 10 minutes long or something. And then took that out and sold the documentary to Showtime.
I think there's so many revelations in the film, and some of the interesting, very dramatic and remarkable things, I think were known at various times, certainly the issues with financing. And I think people were aware that Harvey Keitel, was originally cast in the role that Martin Sheen played. And we get some details of exactly what happened there. But for both of you, but maybe Fax, you could start off by talking about what are some of the outstanding revelations that you feel were in the film. I mean, there's an explanation, for instance, of why the famous scene in the French plantation, why that got left out of the version of the film that was originally released.
Yeah, I mean, Francis was quite clear about that he was upset with the way that whole sequence had been put together. He wasn't happy with any aspect of it, really. When they were looking at the first cut, they were looking to winnow the thing down, and they said, and he was just like, okay, we'll just minimize the French plantation. Yeah, that was revelatory to see. And to be honest with you, I think it was probably, he was right. When he adds it into the to the Redux film, to me, I see why he cut it out. This is just me, my own point of view on it, but I don't think it held up to the rest of the film.
I would say that at that time, and Francis has described it, is the film was weird enough. And he says that, it was hard to get the audience up the river. He said, after 30 years, maybe it wouldn't be so challenging. People could accept it.
Yeah.
It's certainly a scene you can understand when you look at what makes a Francis film. It's about family. It's the dinner table. It's the arguments we have at the dinner table. And here we have the quintessential argument of just like the family, the multiple generations sitting there talking about how they got there, and how it's very much a cautionary tale of Americans are now here and they're going to repeat this. Redux and the 79 version are two different experiences.
Two different films.
Yeah.
Yep.
And for him, it's very important to bring that sort of other aspect of it. And as a director, and that was his original vision. And he sort of wanted to bring that for Redux. So for him, that was an important thing to bring back.
You know, and it also he says a very interesting thing in the documentary where he says, one of the concepts that they were going with was that they were going back in time as they went up the river. And so they eventually got to the 50s where the French had been where the Americans were now. And there's some wonderful ideas that happen in the film. But I do think the French plantation is almost a sidebar. And they go and sort of stops the momentum of the film to have this sort of intellectual discussion about the origins of colonialism, and so and I think that's ultimately why he cut it out.
For him, he sees it as sort of a relaxed moment, or just sort of like, okay, it's so intense where we come up the river just to give the audience a moment to chill, but it's still intense in a whole different level. It's certainly a sidebar.
I'm kind of glad that both versions exist, because I think the plantation scene, when I first saw it in Redux, this is absolutely extraordinary scene. One of the, to me, greatest sequences in cinema. And in a sense, maybe it doesn't belong in the original version. It certainly sheds a lot of light on the Captain Willard character, played by Martin Sheen, because he has the affair with the French woman in there, and she says this incredible line of, "There are two of you, one that loves and one that kills." Something like that, and it's extraordinary.
What I've learned from Francis is having these versions, people get so passionate as fans for what the film, what version they want. And I think that's the best thing as any artist can do.
That's true.
When we worked on Outsiders, so many Outsiders fans love the original, and how the Carmine music worked so sweeping, sort of it's Gone with the Wind experience. And then when he did Complete Novel, well, the original fans were like, no, it's changed. But you talk to people who experienced the 2000 version, that's their version. And they so go to bat for that version. And so I see that same thing with Apocalypse or Redux. It depends on what generation saw what film at the first time. And I think that's the best thing you could do for your own films as an artist. It's like it creates a dialogue, people become passionate, and it carries it through for another generation to see.
One thing I will say about that scene and what you do in the documentary, and what I think is amazing and revelatory about Mr. Coppola, and frankly, just that family's approach. He talks about in that scene, and you have his audio, I want the wine bottles open for an hour, and they should be chilled at about 60 degrees. This will be happening. This will be happening. One thing, and I say this hopefully with just the right perspective, I had the opportunity to work with Mr. Coppola and Sofia Coppola. They are dialed into aesthetic and what needs to be in that scene on a level that the first time you hear it, it's like, but why? And the second time you understand, because you're giving other people a task. And when you give them something legitimately to do, not just busy work, and you paint that picture and you're saying, the wine is important, the glass is important, everything in this scene is important. And I think you end up with, while Mr. Coppola may have been very disappointed with what's going on, you get someone who is very knowledgeable, like Matt Carey, to see it and go, I feel something in this scene beyond its deficiencies. And in fact, Mr. Coppola says something that, again, for me, just someone who works around the business, where he says, you're filled with the day with amazing things going on, and you can't worry about the things you don't catch. Sometimes you have to worry about those things that you do catch that are amazing. And this document, to me, is just, it's such a complete, if you're going to be, if you even think that you want to be a director, watch this and watch, I think, what was it? Lost in La Mancha.
La Mancha.
Yes.
Yeah. Those two films, and
Burden
then
of
come back
Dreams.
and
Gotta see Burden of Dreams.
do you still want to do this?
Do you still want to make a film? Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about the restoration itself, because you have a documentary that was amazing and wonderful, but it's been updated for the modern age. When did even the concept of, hey, we want to revisit this?
I did want to follow up on one point you said before. I'll go into the restoration, but I think what you brought out is very important as Francis as a filmmaker and what he gives his actors. And it shows what he loves about the process is working with the actors and giving them tools. They're not just props. And, he does this with Marlon Brando. The cat comes in and he's like, that's so great. An actor can just take, something that was a mistake and make it so important about the scene. And the wine is important. It's just everything is energized and giving those tools for the actor. I mean, we just did Megalopolis. We did a documentary too on Megalopolis, and he's doing the same thing where he's workshopping, he's giving people props and things and tools and letting their character, what would the character do with this? So when they go and shoot that scene, it's like feeling comfortable, letting the actor feel comfortable that they can work in the room that they would normally do. And I think that's just so fun with Francis. Lets an actor do that and spend time being comfortable with the roles in the environment around them.
Let me just add one thing also. In the film, Martin Sheen says, at one point I said, who is this character? Please give me an insight into the character. And Francis says, he's you. He's whoever you are. Bring yourself to it. And Francis, really, that's how Francis puts you there. Also, just the attention to detail. But he's just I think a master at bringing the actor into the world, which brings the audience in.
Before you get to the restoration, just along that tip, when Martin Sheen is talking about that famous for both what happened in the film, but also in the filming of that scene where his character is basically having a breakdown at the head of it, and Mr. Sheen decides to have a few drinks and truly breaks down. And both of them, there's a moment where Francis is like, get a doctor, get a doctor. I'm going to leave what happens if no one's seen the film, why they need a doctor, just so you'll have a reason to catch it. And Martin Sheen, to his, I guess, credit as an actor, just, I need to film. Let's not worry about what happened to my hand. I need to work this out. Yes. And to literally sit on the floor, covered in blood, crying, and that is not just acting. It's a guy who truly is working out his addictions and things like that. To me, it's.
But can you imagine that happening on set today?
No.
I mean, the studio's just got to shut this down. This can't go.
No, get him into rehab. Even a moment. Again, to the transparency of everything that's happened, where Mr. Coppola said, if Mr. Sheen dies, he's fine until I say he's dead. And you're just like, oh my God. But again, it is a window into
he's always that line has always made him very uncomfortable and rightfully awkward to listen to himself do that. But it's very important because this, and I see this with films in the past, studios get nervous. They don't know they don't know what was going on in the Philippines. They were doing telex machines. You saw the teletype, typing on a machine. That's how they got word over to the West Coast. And anything that leaked out that something was happening could freak them out and shut things down. So that for him was just a moment. I don't know what's going on, but let's not freak everyone out.
The press was quite tough on Coppola over the course of the 3 years that he was making this. I mean, they did not give him any. So he was understandably very worried and upset about any rumors that came out were going to,
There are many conversations about that as well. What the rumor mill is saying is different from what he's saying. And look, there is obviously that moment where Mr. Coppola is asking, I want a doctor. I want a doctor for him. I have no doubt that he is the most caring of individuals. But to me, it's just that moment of when you are saying something from the heart, it may not sound right, but it makes perfect sense in this insanity that's going on. But please do talk about the restoration, because that is part of the reason that we're here. And the film looks amazing as well as sounds amazing.
Yeah, well, it was part of our catalog. For over these years, we've given so much attention to all of Francis's films and this treatment. Hearts of Darkness was like, it's probably time to do something with it. And Eleanor, unfortunately, we lost her last year.
Yeah.
We discussed just her career in filmmaking, and I had told her that we were thinking of Hearts of Darkness. She said, I really want, before I go, she knew she was sick. She knew what was going to happen. That we put attention and make sure that all her legacy in she has done was taken care of. So it was, unfortunately, she never was able to see this version. We did all the films that she had done up in the 70s, was able to see that. But Hearts of Darkness was not one of them that she could see. But she knew that we had been working on it, and it was important to her that we had done that at that time.
Mr. Coppola's approach to filmmaking, for a variety of reasons, some of it's economical, the economics of it. But as you were saying, James, he loved to bring people together and sit at the table and do full rehearsals and spend time together and those kinds of things that now, top star number one, well, I got 3 movies lined up.
Yeah.
And I can't,
Yeah,
and
for a
my
week.
health and well-being, I really need downtime. So it's just different. And when you see, the entire cast of The Godfather, sitting around at a table, being their characters week after week after week, and you go, oh, there's chemistry here. That wasn't an accident. Similar with all the negative things that maybe happened during Apocalypse Now, there's a moment where he says to Dennis Hopper, you got to learn your lines before you forget your lines. I don't care if you do something different, but you got to understand the emotional underpinning. And to me, that's what's different. Some of it, should directors, and I'm not saying this is purely Mr. Coppola, do they walk around, the 800-pound gorillas, yelling at people, things like that? No, they shouldn't be doing that. Do I wish I could get on a set and say, hey, instead of using the plywood, use those 300-pound hand-carved bricks, because that looks real.
Amazing.
There's just a moment where Mr. Coppola is getting on a Huey helicopter that is inches off the ground while it's flying and just stands there. The pilot can't hold it. It starts drifting and he hops off like he was just stepping on a step stool to talk to an actor. To me, it's what a director is willing to do to make the greatest film, one of the greatest films ever made, and you do barter your soul. And you do go there. And you do experience insanity. Say whatever you want, Fax, because you know better than me.
Yeah, I'm just gonna jump on that, John, because that's absolutely it. And this is to me what makes Francis Apocalypse Now, especially, just such an astonishing work of art.
Yeah,
he intended from the very beginning to take a group of people on an experience.
Yeah,
every person was supposed to go down that river and experience personally. You weren't just a lighting technician. You were supposed to be on that same experience, and all of the people informed the beauty of that film. I think that's what he intended. I think that's what he got. That's why everybody we talked to so desperately wanted to talk to us about the making of that film, because it was transformative. And as much as Francis has done so many films, but I think that was the culmination of Zoetrope, was Hearts of Darkness.
And if I could bring it back to Eleanor,
please,
is that what her task was not to shy away from these moments. And she did these with all her documentaries. At the lowest point, they're having these psychological, they can't sleep, they're at their lowest point. She doesn't turn off the camera. She doesn't say, okay, I need to, be a wife and, say, okay, it's okay. No, she just keeps the camera running and keeps asking, well, why do you feel, why do you think that? She's a filmmaker first and a wife second in that role. She did that with all of her documentaries after that. It's like Sophia on Virgin Suicide. She's like, I have not slept for 3 days. I'm having, major breakdown. And she's like, still there in the camera in her face. And Sophia's like, please turn off the camera. It's like, but this is the moment. Yes. She's like, no. And it's always interesting too. It's like there's the dialogue of what a documentarian should be doing, and she had these on tape that she recorded. Francis was like, well, if you missed your shot, just have them do it over again. It was like, but that doesn't seem, that seems fake.
No.
Well, that happens all the time in documentary. It's like, you got your moment. She's like, well, so she was worried about missing anything, and that's why you got your 80 hours. because she wanted it. It was natural, it was real, and it was on camera.
Yeah.
It wasn't something she had to get him to do over again.
Hmm.
Like, go hit your head again into that light, Francis.
You say it very well, and I think one thing to really remind people of is that she was an amazing partner. She certainly was a terrific wife and a terrific mother, but she was a real partner. And you see it, and whether it's I'd forgotten, but there's a card up front. She'd secretly recorded some of these conversations with her husband. She was doing her job,
Yes.
right? She was going to get this documentary, and she did document probably one of. And facts the way you say it, everybody was going to go on a journey, and for the film to turn out the way it did, as painful as it is to watch some moments, folks, sometimes you got to bleed on the page, and you got to bleed on the film, you got to bleed on the lens, you got to bleed on your partners, and you come out of it with something where it's like, okay, that's what it takes to be legitimately great. And the message to me, to all folks, how it's relevant in this moment, as the Netflixes of the world take over, and I don't mean in a bad way. We go through these ups and downs. It's a big corporate space. Francis Ford Coppola then, Francis Ford Coppola now with Megalopolis, will put his money where his mouth is. And to me, to all the people, including myself, I put myself ahead of the list. You bitch and moan about the big companies and all that. Well, I can't afford to do Apocalypse Now, but what can I afford to do on my own? Gentlemen, Matt and I were excited to have this conversation today. I think that's an understatement. This has been one of the best conversations I think we've had on Doc Talk, and we've been doing it steadily for 2 years. Our first retrospective on a film.
I hope I don't hear it next week. Do you say the same thing?
Oh, no. I promise not to.
Only if we have Lost in La Mancha on. That's the only, unless they did a 4K restoration I'm not aware of. No, you're going to be safe in terms of the best restorative documentary throwback episode we've done.
Okay.
I think you're good for a month, gentlemen, easily.
Well, thank you so much. That's a high compliment, and from the two of you guys, really, really respectful of everything you guys have done, and thank you.
Next time I'll be on time.
Yeah, listen, only because that'll give us another extra 6 or 7 minutes to speak with you. And may I say one thing personally, because I had the opportunity to meet Eleanor, and she's an amazing person. She didn't get to see your restoration. I can't speak like we were tight friends. I can't imagine she would not be proud of what you've done and just keeping this story alive.
I feel she would have been very happy with it.
Can I just throw something in about James? I mean,
absolutely.
This is beautiful. The film is just beautiful. I mean, I don't remember how we color timed the original. I don't think we probably spent very much time on it. So the film has always had, it's been fine and good. It looked good, but what James and his team brought to this thing it's so beautiful. It's so, the depth of it's 16 millimeter negative, and they just did a wonderful job. So it's really worth seing this new version. It's a new
Fax
experience.
was there in the room too, doing the color timing. He
was there for, I don't know, a day. I mean, it's a beautiful restoration.
And it will be in theater. So folks, you have no excuse for not seeing it in its glory as intended in the theaters. James, Fax, thank you. Thank you for the restoration. Thank you for the work.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
For joining us. Deeply appreciate it. Thank you.
John, I just love that opportunity to talk about, again, what I think is one of the greatest documentaries of all time.
Yeah.
Such a pleasure to hear these insights from him. I wanted to emphasize, and you brought this up, and when you mentioned the scene between Dennis Hopper, the conversation that he has with Francis Ford Coppola, which is very, very funny and insightful. There's other moments of humor in it. One of my favorites is when Marlon Brando is doing a scene and he sort of pauses and you think, oh, this is Brando being dramatic. And he says, I think I swallowed a bug. It's hilarious.
Watching that raw footage and having stood on a set at times where you just realize you can plan, you can prep, you can do everything you want, and then you're just standing there with 120 people looking at you and go, okay, Captain, what do we do? It's remarkable to see also, I think, someone in Mr. Coppola who can tap into chaos. Not everyone can tap into chaos. Not everybody can steer towards the storm and say, we're going to take these wins and actually get where we're going. As we said in the conversation, yeah, there's some elements of directing and filmmaking that probably should stay in the 70s or early 80s. But there are other elements where there's a level of confidence or craziness that you have to have that, um, and I mean this genuinely, normal human beings do not have that. Airline pilots have that capacity, firefighters have that capacity, filmmakers have that capacity. Everybody else runs away from trouble as they should.
Yeah, and in terms of the humor, it's sort of interesting that you fastened on this. I didn't realize it, but Fax Bahr has an interesting background also in comedy that I think came after he did Hearts of Darkness.
Would have come after, but not that far after. And
Yeah.
just, I try to be diligent. I say all the time that you are a true journalist and you do your homework. So I try to do mine. But I found out and I confirmed with Fax, who, when you see the documentary Hearts of Darkness, you assume and should that he's a serious, talented, thoughtful filmmaker and very focused on restoring and putting things together in a very logical, sensible way. He is the co-creator of the late night comedy show Mad TV, if you could believe it, which was meant to be, it ran on Fox, I think in the early 2000s,
Forever.
up to about 2006, 2007. But it was like a Saturday Night Live light show. And I believe Quincy Jones may have been a producer on that as well.
That's right.
So Fax is a man, and I don't want to say that James isn't, but Fax is certainly a man of many, many talents and broad capacities. If you can put together, as he said, 80 hours of sometimes insane footage and make a very coherent, beautiful documentary such as Hearts of Darkness, but at the same time pitch and put together Mad TV, yeah, you got talent.
Again, this film lives on, and it's just a wonderful tribute to everyone involved in Apocalypse Now, of course, but those who made this incredible documentary.
Yeah, and it's amazing to even think, as I said, it was about 50 years ago next year that they will have started this journey. It was 3 years to make the film, but they started shooting around 1976. And you have to remember, the fall of Saigon was 75. And for people to say, hey, we're going to make a film that is going to touch on probably, one of the lowest points in the American psyche, that they made this film at all is really remarkable. And I'm with you. This is, I feel like we've certainly hit our stride. We've had some amazing conversations, but man, there's nothing like walking away. And I say this with the requisite humility, but you walk away and I was like, hey, you know what? That was a good show. And I think we can safely say this week, this was a good show. And I think next week, I'm going to be predictive. I think we're going to have an amazing show because very central to it is going to be me and a special guest speaking with you about where we are, the state of docs in June, July 2025, which I'm seriously looking forward to. Said it many times, you've seen more docs than I have. I've got a weekend where I'm going to really dive into documentaries, and I'm kind of looking forward to just kind of where we are and what we've seen that we've liked and reading the tea leaves a little bit.
A little bit of an Oscar preview. By the way, I just looked up with Hearts of Darkness. It was not nominated for an Academy Award, which is quite astounding to me. It did win a couple of Emmys. So anyway, it's probably a good cautionary note to enter any discussion of Oscar frontrunners. We just never
you bring
know.
up something very interesting, and I don't know what the rules were back then, and it was sold to Showtime, and it ran on Showtime. So I don't know if that had been...
You're probably right,
up through, and I can only really say To Let It Fall. That's the only film that a documentary I've tried to run in two spaces. We declined going down the television route. We wanted to go the theatrical route because we had two very separate cuts. So the rules have changed a little bit in the years. Here's what we're going to say to our audience. We're going to try to do a little bit of a dive, maybe find out what the rules were. I'm giving myself work, but I'm all alone this weekend, so maybe that'll keep me out of trouble.
Oh, it's many, many pages of rules, so I'll put you to sleep.
In some ways, the documentary was rewarded, but the biggest reward is, does it stand the test of time?
Yeah,
and I
absolutely.
think, without a doubt, it stands the test of time. I will just say, having again met Eleanor Coppola, having met Francis Ford Coppola, having met Sofia Coppola, they're just wonderful human beings, artists, people who really want to support people coming up. And as Fax mentioned, there's a moment at the end of the film where Francis is saying, if some young lady in Ohio wants to he was talking camcorder. Now we're to the point where every young person has an iPhone or a phone in their pocket they can shoot with. This is a family that believes anybody can be an artist and is willing to stand behind that and support it. And I just want to say, meeting them and knowing them early in my career, even now, I don't think I can wrap my head around it. So it's a joy to just be able to sing the praises of Eleanor Coppola and really speak to Mr. Coppola too. That, like I said, he's a filmmaker that I don't think they're going to be filmmakers like him coming around again. Even greats like Chris Nolan, who I think is amazing. He's just a different guy in a different era. So happy to share this episode with you, Matt. Thank you. And thanks to our audience. Looking forward to next week. It's going to be a fun episode. We hope you'll join us again. Absolutely, here on Doc Talk.